Okay. So I think we're going to get started. My name is Scott Wallace. I'm the professor of economics and the director for the Center for Business and Economic Insight here at UWSP. And I'm very, very excited and very honored to introduce our speaker of our Business and Society lecture series, the University of Chicago economist and UWSP alum, John List. In his presentation, John will discuss his latest book, The Voltage Effect, How to Make Good Ideas Great and Great Ideas Scale. It was just released in February, but it's really doing very well on the bestseller list. It's on the bestseller list of the Wall Street Journal, and Publishers Weekly, and USA Today. So it's been doing very, very well. Congratulations, John. Just want to give you a little bit of background about John. John grew up in Sun Prairie, Wisconsin, and attended UWSP as an undergrad. Randy Cray, who's in the audience right now, was one of John's economic professors. Raise your hand, Randy. Thank you. John was also an academic All-American in golf here at UWSP and considered a career in professional golf, which he actually talks about in his book. After graduating from UWSP in 1992, John earned his PhD in economics at the University of Wyoming. He's held teaching positions at the University of Central Florida, University of Arizona, and the University of Maryland at College Park. And then John was appointed full professor at the Economics Department of University of Chicago in 2004. Where later he was given an endowed professorship. John also has, in the midst of all of this activity, has also served as a senior economist in the President's Council of Economic Advisors from 2002 to 2003. He's accomplished a lot. According to Research Papers in Economics, which is an organization that tracks research in terms of their impact. John is currently the 8th most influential economist in the world as of January of this year. He's been recognized as a true pioneer in the areas of field experiments and behavioral economics. His research spans many different topic areas, including environmental economics, charitable giving, education, and many, many more areas. In The Voltage Effect, John basically gives a tutorial on how to scale new ventures, new policies, ideas, and businesses to ensure their success. He draws for considerable research experience in providing a practical step-by-step process in terms of identifying those key traits that are necessary for scaling and what practices should be adopted to maximize their impact. So John will be presenting for, I think, approximately an hour, and then we'll take questions later after that time. But please extend a warm welcome to John List.
Can everyone hear me? Can you hear me in the back okay? All right. So last time I was standing here was in 2008. So it really is wonderful to be back. And I want to, first of all, I don't see Chancellor Tom. Did he? There you are. Chancellor Tom, Kevin, Elizabeth. Thank you so much, Marty. Hopefully Marty's watching. Marty Loyal. Thank you so much. You are all killing it. You are doing me very proud. And I didn't know that I was going to say that when I was driving up here from Sun Prairie. I'm a little bit busy, so I haven't followed carefully what's going on, but yesterday I had a remarkable day talking to students, administrators, thinking about a vision of what we represent. I'm a first-gen kid, as you'll learn, and we represent the first-gen community here. This is a perfect match for first-gen kids. And what all of you are setting up, I'm super proud of. What you are doing outside the classroom, giving students a chance outside of the classroom, is better than what we are doing at the University of Chicago. I'm visiting Harvard this year as well for the year, and it is better than what Harvard is doing. So I want to say congratulations. This is great stuff. And I want to give you guys a hand. Now, and I've talked to the Alumni and Support Office about how I'm going to help on that, because I believe you build on strength, but we can announce that later. Let's talk about all of you, and then I'll talk about me in my book. So let me take a poll so I know who I'm talking to. Please raise your hand if you have flown on United Airlines in the last decade. Please raise your hand. Wow, flyers. Please raise your hand if you have ridden in an Uber or Lyft in the last 5 years. Good. Please raise your hand if you have been part of one of the last two presidential elections. If you voted in one of the last two presidential elections, raise your hand. Okay. So my research would say about half of you are lying. Because society tells you you need to raise your hand. People are pointing at each other. He's lying for sure. Because if you don't vote, you're scorned. Right? That's a social norm. Has anyone not raised their hand at least once? Awesome. Guess what? All of you have been part of one of my experiments. That's what I do. I use the world as my lab. It's not creepy in the sense that I can put your name with an action. Okay, it's not that creepy. But what I can tell you is if you want to fly, say, from a local airport to Madison and then Madison to Denver, I can tell you if I raise the price $100, how you respond and how people like all of you respond. And I can tell you when I change a Lyft price by $1, I can tell you how you respond. All of you probably take Uber and Lyft like you raised your hand. You probably all tip, right? Raise your hand if you tip when you take an Uber or Lyft. Okay, so later I'm going to tell you that most of you are lying for sure now, right? Because only 1% of people tip on every trip on Uber. 1%. However, 95% of people tip every time in an ordinary cab when it's face-to-face. What do you think? Social norms matter. Incentives matter. And incentives are beyond prices. Okay? Let me tell you a little bit about myself in the book. So I graduated from Sun Prairie High School in 1987, and I came here, and my dream was to be a golf professional. I came here to play golf. I likely would not have gone to college if not for the golf team here, and Pete Casson, who recruited me. I had to fight my parents. My parents said, "Why do you need to go to college?" A lot of kids face that today. They view it as an affront to the family if you need to go and do something else that people haven't done in your family before. Okay, so I got here, and I was a reasonable golfer. But within a month, I realized I will never be good enough. So when it was mentioned he was thinking about professional golf, yeah, it was for like a second. And I knew I was not good enough. So I had to pivot. I had to quit on that dream. And my new dream became economics. Okay? So now I've gone and done a bunch of economics in the academic world. I started as chief economist at Uber in 2015. I worked there for 2 years, and a lot of you probably have heard about the Uber stories. Most of them are true. And if you watch Super Pumped, I told them to have Matt Damon play me, but they're not listening to me. So when Super Pumped comes, I don't think the chief economist is going to have a cameo, but hopefully Matt Damon plays that cameo. I doubt it, though. About 4 years ago, I moved to Lyft. And I quit on a Friday afternoon at Uber, and that Monday I started at Lyft. And you can say, that's crazy, how can that happen? California labor laws allow that to happen. As long as I leave my brain at Uber, I can go to Lyft and be chief economist. Okay, so I've been chief economist at Lyft for 4 years. And 3 days ago I quit. I turned in my resignation because it will soon be announced that I will be the new chief economist at Walmart. Okay, and that will start very soon. So I'm moving to that space. I've done a fair amount of science in rideshare. I'm very proud of it. The book talks about a fair amount. So if there is a book 3, it will probably be transforming Walmart and Sam's, et cetera, and how they do data science. Okay, so I'm taking my talents to Walmart. And I'm beyond a business type person, though. Back in 2007, a community called Chicago Heights called me. Has anyone heard of Chicago Heights? Raise your hand if you've heard of it. Great. That's a proud community, right? A very proud community. And was once a manufacturing hub of Illinois. All those jobs have gone. Broken down buildings, households, dreams are gone. They called me and said, can you help us? Now you know what any good pointer says. Of course I can help you. And of course the next question is, tell me about how much resources you have so I can help you. 0, like any community around. So I started working on funding, and I started thinking about how I can help this community. My first instinct was I should help in the high schools. The reason why is because 1,000 kids start high school every year in Chicago Heights. Only 480 end up graduating. The other 520 drop out, and they drop out right around their 16th birthdays. So I said, well, let me try there first. And that's in the Freakonomics documentary, actually. If you've heard of Freakonomics, my best friend wrote that book, Steve Levitt. There's a documentary on it. We're one of the segments in that documentary, if you want to watch that. That's where we started. We started there because that looked to be the place of the problem. It's hard, though, when you start talking to a 15-year-old who is doing math at a 2nd grade level and who is reading at a 1st grade level. It's very hard to help that child. Now, that's a child who the public school system has let down, right? There's no chance they should be freshmen in high school and doing math at a 2nd grade level. That's not even multiplication tables. So we helped some kids, roughly 40 to 50 kids we helped graduate. That's great. But we realized to make fundamental change, you need to go back. So we went all the way back to the 0 to 5 space. And we started a pre-K program. Now, when you start a pre-K program, you have to start with money. So I went to Ann and Ken Griffin, 2 very generous friends, and they gave me $20 million to start a pre-K. The idea was, I want to learn about what's called the education production function. What are the best ways to teach kids and their parents, 3, 4, 5-year-olds. I wanted to help Chicago Heights kids, and then I wanted to produce a curriculum that we could scale, that we could take to everyone. And this wasn't for sale. This was for free. Okay, soup to nuts. Get a building, get the licenses, hire the janitors, get the buses, get the teachers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We opened the doors in 2010. Now, I'm boots on the ground every day. Opened the doors, and by 2014, our results are remarkable. We are taking a kid within 5 or 6 months from Chicago Heights up to Evanston in terms of test scores. Evanston, of course, houses Northwestern University, the safety school around Chicago. Right? University of Chicago, then we have a safety school. I was super proud of this because we were pushing both cognitive skills and executive function skills. Executive function skills are some of the most underappreciated skills, but they're some of the most valued skills in the labor market. Grit, resilience, self-control. theory of mind. Guess what? I wanted to go and tell everyone about my program. So I went and talked to policymakers. At that point, I knew a lot of policymakers. Barack was in the presidential office, and I knew a lot of Republicans. I served President Bush too. So I served in Bush too. I knew Barack in their group. Arne Duncan was the Secretary of Education. He's a neighbor of ours. Knew a lot of local policymakers. Bruce Rauner had just become the governor. Bruce has funded some of my work as well. So I knew a lot of policymakers. So I went to talk to them and said, you need to take my curriculum and use it. It's free, and if anyone in here wants it, it's 8 binders. You can have it. I'll print it out free for you. Here comes a slap in the face. Professor List, your program looks great in Chicago Heights, but don't expect it to happen at scale. I had been doing field experiments since back here. You might not believe that, but when I learned from Randy, Larry Weiser, Dennis Palmini, etc., I would take those theories, I would take them to baseball card shows on weekends. That's where I started my field experiments. I would go to conventions and test economic theory in the field. That's how I made my name. And this person was telling me it won't scale? Never heard this before. So I said, well, why don't you think it will scale? And they typically said, there's no silver bullet. Now at this point, you say, well, I want to go to Walmart and pick up a dozen of these silver bullets, right? Where do I find one? They said, well, we're not really sure, but what we can tell you is everyone promises their idea works, and it never works as well as they promise when we scale it. Okay. So at this point, I had to have an honest discussion with myself because I had never worked on that aspect of the problem. You might ask, why haven't we taken care of poverty? Why haven't we figured out public education? Why haven't we figured out climate? I argue in the book it's because from the very beginning of our research process, we don't think about scale. What we do as academics is we want to get publications in top journals. So we do efficacy tests. We give our idea its best shot. And then we publish it and we don't tell everyone else that it was an efficacy test. Medical trials do the same thing, but at least they tell you. Then you have to do phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. We're efficacy and then done. And that's why so many projects fail. So I started a research agenda back in 2014 on the science of scaling. And it was primarily art back then. Move fast and break things. Fake it till you make it. Now, what happened to her, right? She's going to be making it in jail pretty soon, isn't she? Theranos, right? Elizabeth Holmes. I talk about her in chapter 1. Throw spaghetti against the wall, whatever sticks, you cook it. Okay? Art is great. I love art when it hangs on the wall. I hate art when it dictates how we spend billions of dollars of our taxpayers' money. Okay, so I started by thinking of, is it true that what happens in the small is different than what happens in the large? Is that statement from the policymakers true? It is true. That's what I call the voltage effect. The voltage effect is about how the impact of your idea changes when you go from the small to the large. When you go from Chicago Heights to Dayton or Minneapolis or New York, I call that horizontal scaling. If you think about Chicago Heights and having a bunch of early pre-K programs around Chicago. So you're drawing from the same input market, labor market. I call that vertical scaling. These two are two very different conceptions of scaling, and they both deserve a conversation. Okay, so where the policymakers were correct, there is a lot of evidence for the voltage effect. In economics, we have laws. Law of demand, law of supply. You could call this the law of the voltage effect. Okay. Now, the other question that I wanted to go after was, is this a silver bullet problem? Because that's what the policymakers said too. And if so, what is that silver bullet? That's where they were exactly wrong. This is not a silver bullet problem. This is quite the opposite. This is a weakest link problem, not a best shot problem. And when I say weakest link, I want you to think about Anna Karenina. Anybody in here read Anna Karenina, Tolstoy's old? A few of us. Do you remember the first line in Anna Karenina? First line, anyone? Happy families are all alike. Each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. That's ideas. Scalable ideas are all alike. Each unscalable idea is unscalable in its own way. But the book talks about the 5 links that you have to ensure that your idea has a chance to scale. But the book is about ideas. You still need to execute. And the book is about, does your idea have the ingredients that will allow it to scale? I don't talk about leadership. I don't talk about execution. I don't talk about supply chain. I simply talk about, does your idea have a chance? And if it doesn't, that might be fine. My family is essentially one man, one truck, one good life. Nothing wrong with that, but it's important to know that before you invest millions of dollars in an idea that never had a shot to scale, right? Know how big your tent can be. So let's talk a little bit about those 5 ideas, and that's the front half of the book. And then I'll talk a little bit about the back half as well. Okay. Idea number 1 is called false positives. Anyone ever hear of false positives, those words? Raise your hand if you've heard of false positives. We've all heard of false positives. But this is the major reason why ideas fail. And I start this chapter talking about Nancy Reagan. I don't know what all of you think about Nancy Reagan, but she was one of the nicest people who have ever walked the earth. She would bring us in hot cookies a lot in DC. Her dream was to stop teens from using drugs. That was her shtick. Right? Every first lady has a shtick. That was hers. So she grabbed onto an idea that was put forward by DARE, which is associated with just say no. Anyone remember that social inoculation program? Raise your hand. All right. I do too. Because the reason why I start my book off like that, I was sitting in high school in 1985, 86. So if you're my era, you were sitting there and then an official would come in and they would say, we know you're thinking about drugs. Drugs are everywhere. And the quotes are wonderful from this program. Drugs will make your brain shrink and all kinds of stuff that was crazy, but they were saying it to try to scare you. Social inoculation. I can still remember looking at my teacher. I think it was Mr. Twiddell, if any of you are from Sun Prairie. Mr. Twiddell. And I said, I didn't call him Pete, but really in my mind I was thinking, okay, Pete, there's no way this will work. No way. I don't do drugs, but I have a lot of friends who do. There's no way. In fact, if anything, it's probably going to get the people who have never tried it to dabble a little bit. Right? What are these guys talking about? Maybe give me some. He said, you know, I don't know, John. They say they have data. He was right. I have now dug into those data, and they were pretty good data. I'd love to stand up here and say they only had 20 people in the experiment. They didn't. They had 1,777 people in the experiment. I'd love to stand up here and say they made errors. And I'm here to tell you what their errors were. There weren't errors. They did a really good job. The experiment was in Honolulu, Hawaii. And it looked like it had voltage. But in the end, it didn't. And when they went back and tried it again in Honolulu later, it didn't. When they tried it in LA, Denver, DC, as a test, it did not have voltage. It was simply a false positive. Now you might wonder, how often does this happen? In the best case scenario, it happens 5% of the time. But the way we do science today, I estimate it happens about 40 to 50% of the time. And I have several academic papers, if you want to read those, about why that's true. Okay? The false positive problem is real, and we have wasted billions and billions, and even more importantly, we've wasted time. Because remember, the opportunity cost of time to solve a problem is super important. That's vital sign number one. Vital sign number two is understand how big of a slice of the pie your idea can capture. And here I talk about the Arch Deluxe. Anybody remember the Arch Deluxe? You a burger guy, Randy? I'm a burger guy too. So McDonald's in the 90s, the CEO has an idea. The idea is, I want to introduce the Arch Deluxe. So he did what every good CEO still does today. He brings in a focus group. And then he brings in another and another and another. Bunch of focus groups. Just like in a room like this, he gives them all an Arch Deluxe. They try it, and then they fill out a survey. And they tell the CEO that they love the Arch Deluxe. Love, love, love it. And then the typical question, if this is introduced in the next 6 to 12 months, will you consume it? Will you buy it? Yes, I'll buy it. And then they give prices. Would you buy it at $250? Would you buy it at $350? $450? Yes, yes, yes. What we don't understand is when we do that, there are two fundamental problems relying on data like that. The first is, this is a select group of people. These are people like Randy and me, hamburger lovers who love McDonald's, and we volunteer to go in, and then we go in and consume the burgers. The other part is a little bit harder to understand, and that's the incentives. What are the incentives of the person sitting in the room? How many of you trade stock and options? Stocks or options? Raise your hand if you trade options. Option value is important, right, Marty? We pay money to have the right to buy a stock in the future, don't we? In fact, I'm holding options right now for a company called Amex. They're deep sea drilling company. It's a long shot. But I bought some options, so I have the right to buy some shares in August at $7 a share. Price is like $5.95 right now or so. I have to pay for that option. Through that lens, if I'm sitting in a focus group, what am I thinking when I'm filling out that form when somebody says, would you buy this burger if it's introduced? This feels like a free option to me. Yes, yes, yes. And then when it's introduced, I'll decide. It doesn't cost me anything. And then when it's introduced, maybe I'll try it once, maybe I think it's terrible, and I'll stick with the Big Mac. That's exactly what happened. And that cost the CEO his job. It's the Arch Deluxe. So I talk about that in the chapter. I also talk about membership programs. So my big fight at Lyft was about Pink, its membership program. Anybody in here, are you a member of Pink? Okay, that's what I told Logan, the founder. Nobody will buy Pink. Like the worst membership idea in the world. Like Costco and Sam's, I totally get it, because you have this entry fee, and then once you're there, you get low-price goods. But Lyft, let's face it, I'm looking at Lyft and I look at Uber. I'm a dual apper. Why would I pay money to have the right to force me to just look at Lyft? It doesn't make sense. So I talk about that. Our early signals were from a hamburger-loving group, so to speak. And that's what I talk about in chapter 2. We always, always, always overestimate our audience. Okay? Vital sign number 3, I title it, Is it the chef or is it the ingredients? In many cases, there are unique situations that we can thrive in, but those unique situations cannot be replicated at scale. So you can think, well, what's he talking about then with chef or ingredients? I dug into restaurants. A lot of restaurants try to scale. The ones that fail every time are the ones whose secret sauce was a unique chef. So the chef is killing it, and he or she says, wow, we're making $1 million a year. We might as well have 30 or 50 of these, and then I'm going to make $30 or $50 million a year. So they scale, but the chef can only be in one restaurant at a time. Unique humans do not scale. They also can't teach others, but they think they can. An error that's commonly made is the chef said, I know the secret sauce, I can teach it. That's my IP. Never works. That's a definition of unique. You can't teach it. The restaurants that make it are the ones whose initial success was built on ingredients that can scale. Whether it's pepperoni or sausage or Domino's or what have you, it's the ingredients. Or occasionally the brick oven, but sometimes brick ovens don't scale either. Sometimes they do. Okay? But the idea here is what I call policy-based evidence. You've all heard evidence-based policy. Evidence-based policy is use data to make decisions. I think that is the reason why we are making mistakes in scaling, because we don't turn that around and give policymakers policy-based evidence. What do I mean by that? You go to scale and you think, what are the constraints? What are the warts? What are the problems that we, as we grow larger, I'm going to face? We should bring that back to the Petri dish. Okay, so as an example, think about Chicago Heights. What I did in Chicago Heights was I hired 30 teachers for my Chicago Heights program. And I thought I was being clever by making the following decision. I said, I want to hire those 30 teachers exactly like Chicago Heights would hire them. Makes sense, right? Because I want to think about scaling. That is wonderful if you're thinking about horizontal scaling, because I'll be able to hire 30 good teachers in Dayton, DC, Denver, New York, etc. But what if I have to hire 30,000 good teachers around Chicago? Hiring 30 good teachers is one thing, 30,000 is altogether different. So if I want to vertically scale, I don't know if my program will vertically scale, because I don't know if my program works with the types of teachers I will be able to hire at scale. And that was an experimental error that I made. I should have been hiring a bunch of marginal teachers, because at scale, that's what I will have if I want the budget to stay the same. Sure, if you want to break the budget, we'll get to that with vital sign number 5. But if I want to maintain the budget, I have to come up with an idea that will work with the types of teachers I can get at scale. If it doesn't, it can't scale. It can scale horizontally. That's a big difference between horizontal and vertical scaling now. Okay? That's vital sign number 3. Vital sign number 4 is spillovers. Now, in your mind, you can go in a lot of different directions when we're talking about spillovers. So all of our ideas have some kind of spillover. Let's turn back the clock to the mid-60s. Raise your hand if you've heard of Ralph Nader. Wow, group after my heart. He went after it in the 60s, didn't he? He went after the federal government in particular with safety, with automobiles and driving on our highways. His 1965 book was a runaway bestseller. The federal government listened to Ralph Nader. And in 1968, there was new legislation that said every automobile has to be equipped with a seatbelt. A lot of the youngsters are like, what? Yeah, back in the day, no seatbelt. So their engineers estimated that they would have huge savings in traffic fatalities because of that. Made sense, right? That's what Ralph Nader told us. Guess how many traffic fatalities the experts estimated were actually saved because of those seatbelts? There's a paper written in 1975 by a fellow named Sam Peltzman. Sam's one of my colleagues at the University of Chicago. Guess what he estimated were the number of lives saved because of seatbelts by 1975? Randy, do you see that number? 0. You might be thinking, why? People responded by driving more aggressively. It's called the Peltzman Effect, and it happens all the time. People drove more aggressively. They undid the good stuff of the regulation. When I was in the White House, we worked on safety helmets for bikers. Same thing happens there. Bikers drive more aggressively, and they get harmed more often. But there was a twist to my study. It was not only that bikers themselves would drive more aggressively, but automobiles would drive closer to them if they were wearing a bike helmet compared to when they did not wear a bike helmet. So it was double jeopardy with bike helmets, and that undid the good stuff there too in our data. And these are data from 2001 and 2002. So I don't know what's happened since then. That's one really unique kind of spillover. A very different kind of spillover happened to me at Uber. So let's turn back the clock to Saturday night, January 27th, 2017. President Trump puts out an executive order, and it was an executive order on immigration. Anybody remember that executive order on immigration? Some people are saying yes. People went nuts. Do you remember? Folks just went nuts about that executive order. For their part, the cabbies around JFK in New York City went on strike. They were trying to send a signal to the president about what they thought of his executive order. So whenever something like that happens in a market, Uber had a law or a rule that they turned off surge when there was a market interruption. They were trying to do the right thing because they don't want to be viewed as price gougers. Turn off surge. Surge, remember, is when there's a lot of demand and very little supply, they raise price. Now you can think in your mind, they're raising price to make more money. That's probably part of it. The other part is they're trying to clear the market using the pricing mechanism. That's what economists believe in. That's why I went to Uber and Lyft, because I believe prices are important to use to clear markets. I can still remember flying into Logan Airport and standing in line for an hour and a half for a taxi, right? You can say, well, what was rationing trips before Uber and Lyft? It was wait time. And it was like might makes right. You'd wave, you'd elbow the guy, and jump in. That's what rationed before prices, Okay, so that's their price clearing mechanism, surge. They turned off surge. The cabbies took exception to that. They thought Uber was trying to break up their strike. And then a cabbie did something that has fundamentally changed rideshare as we know it. Back then, we were killing Lyft, killing them. They were lucky to have 5%, 7% in markets. They were waving the white flag. If you think about boxing, 7, 8, 9, we were literally counting. They were done. That tweet changed the entire market. Now, as you know, I'm at Lyft. We have 30 to 35% of market share now across North America. That threw us a lifeline. Okay, back to Saturday night, 2017. Travis Kalanick calls me that night and says, we're getting killed. Within several weeks, we have lost so many drivers and so many riders because of that tweet. My team was called Ubernomics, Team Ubernomics and Uber. Travis said, John, your team is responsible for getting the drivers back. Okay. My quote, big idea was, we need to add tipping in the app. A lot of you might not realize this, but when Uber started, there was no tipping. What it became, and I was irritated by this, is the driver would put a tin cup in the back seat or tape it to the front seat and say, oh, can you give me a tip before you leave? Consumers were getting angry about that. But nonetheless, there was no in-app tipping. But all the drivers wanted it. They wanted it because they thought their wages would go up because of tipping. Okay, so I ended up with a few others convincing Travis that we are going to add tipping to the app. So since it was my idea, my team got to be in charge of the rollout, the scale up. We introduced tipping in the early summer via experiments in various markets. For example, in Chicago, we allowed 5% of the drivers to receive tips. And then what we looked at was, what are their earnings and how much did they work? We found great stuff. They worked more and they made more. Good, good. Guess what happened when we scaled that up in September and October? So not only 5% of the drivers would be able to receive tips, but all the drivers would receive tips. Well, here's what happened. They all worked more. That's great. However, the demand did not change. So what happened was more drivers were driving around with empty cars more often, and you're only paid when you drive Uber and Lyft if there's someone in your back seat. You're paid time and distance. So the fact that you were not being paid, of course, that exactly undid the positive wage effect that we observed when only 5% of people were receiving tips. That was a market equilibrium that was changing, and it changed exactly to offset the wage effect. That happens sometimes too. That's a spillover. The other kind of spillover I talk about in the chapter is what happened at Check. So at Check, remember, I have this glorious 3, 4, and 5-year-old pre-K program. Thousands of people sign up, and I randomly put some in treatment and some in control. Well, what happens is some of the control kids live nearby some of the treatment kids. So now the good stuff really happened, because if you were a control kid and you lived nearby enough treatment kids, i.e. if you lived nearby 10 treatment kids, It was like you were in treatment yourself. And it worked through two channels. The cognitive test scores were moved because of your parents. The executive function skills were moved because of the child you were playing with. Now you might say, well, how did that work? How does it work through the parents? Parents who lived nearby parents of kids who were in our program, they were more likely to sign up for substitute programs. They saw another kid getting the good stuff from our program, so that induced them to go ahead and get different treatment or get different pre-K. That's how it worked through the parents. Now the kids, it just worked through the kids playing together. Okay? So that's a spillover. The last one is the supply side. So I'm a Chicago economist. I do both demand and supply. We've been talking about demand the whole time, which is what basically the government always talks about. But when you talk to firms, they tend to start with the supply side. They start with the ideas, does my idea have economies of scale? Think about teachers. If I had to hire 30,000 really, really good teachers, I'm going to have to go up the supply curve, aren't I? When I go up the supply curve, what happens to my budget? I get killed. There's a voltage drop because of the supply side. Even though the benefits side maintains, the supply side kills me. A lot of times when we vertically scale, we get killed because of diseconomies of scale. Okay, so you'll learn about that on the supply side chapter. Let me now talk for the last 10 minutes about the second half of the book. The first chapter in the second half talks about incentives. And I guess the first incentive here is kind of like a social incentive, right? My friends from Siren Club, can you stand up? I've met two great entrepreneurs. I want to say congratulations on the great product. Not bad. But I feel drunk, you're right, it's acting. This better be the non-alcoholic stuff. Incentives are all around us. Social norms of helping somebody who is a good person and is trying to change the world is all around us. In this chapter, I talk about why do people tip when it's face-to-face? Remember, I said 95% of the time. But they don't tip when they're on their own and nobody else can see it. The social norm around tipping in restaurants or cabbies or wherever, it tells you you are a jackass if you don't tip. So guess what? You do it. You might not like it, but you don't want to pay the cost of violating the social norm. So you do it. Non-financial incentives are everywhere. And we should leverage them for the better. Not only just to make profits, but to make the world a better place, we should be leveraging non-financial incentives. You'll read a lot about them in chapter 6. You'll also read about how you can frame financial incentives in a different way. So guess what I did when I incentivized my teachers? In fact, the entire school district allowed me to do an experiment with teachers, K through 12. And my idea was I want to think about the best ways to incentivize teachers. What's the typical way that we incentivize people? We tell them, work for the year, the entire year, and at the end, I will evaluate you and you will get your Christmas bonus. I was department chair at University of Chicago for 6 years. That's how I did the rewards. At Lyft, I do the same thing. But here's what I tried with teachers. I did that approach, but I compared it to this kind of approach. I gave teachers money up front when the school year started in September, and I told them that if your students achieve, you can keep the money, but if they don't, at the end of the year, I will take some or all of it away. It's called the clawback. And you can think about doing it provisionally too. Put it in an account. And if you achieve, you get to keep the account at the end of the year. If you don't achieve, you claw some of it back. It has two big effects. One effect, that person will work harder during the year. It worked in Chicago, it worked in Chinese manufacturing plants, it works with Wisconsin farmhands, it works in Nepal. It's been replicated over and over again. The clawback works to get people to work harder. Now, what it also does is when it's in a provisional account, people leave the job less often. And the reason why is because they see firsthand what they are leaving. Of course, they are leaving the bonus if they leave in January or in July, let's say, anyway, but it's not front and center in their mind. And if you make it front and center in an account that they can see, they're much less likely to leave the job. So this sounds great, right? They work harder, they leave less. You can say, well, what's the bad stuff? The bad stuff is some employees hate it. They hate it because they have loss aversion. But that's the reason why it works. It works because people despise losing something. In fact, losing $5 is identical to gaining 10. This is what the best estimates teach us. So basically what I'm telling you is if you use the clawback, you double the incentive. Okay, and it's all about framing. I'm starting a new journal right now called the Journal of Political Economy Micro, and that's how I am incentivizing my editors. At the beginning of the year, they each get $25,000, and every paper that takes them longer than 45 days to make a decision on, I take back $500. And then I give that to the referees, who aren't paid anything. Okay? Talk the talk, walk the walk. Another chapter in the back half talks about quitting. And I come straight out and say, we don't quit enough. I know all the old school people in here now hate me because I know you had an inspirational poster in your room in the 80s, probably had Vince Lombardi's picture on it, right? Winners never quit, quitters never win. I get all that. I was raised like that too. Society has taught us that the most repugnant word in the English language is quitting. Right? You shouldn't quit. That's what we're taught. I quit about 2 months into my golf deal here, didn't I? I didn't quit the team. That's not appropriate. You finish what you start. I finished my 4 years of golf, and it went all right, as you mentioned. I was academic American, All-American 2 years. But I quit on the dream of being a golfer, and I developed a new dream of being an economist because I had great econ professors here at UW-Stevens Point who supported and nourished me. That was my dream. The other reason why we don't quit enough is because of ourselves. We have a bias that I want to try to de-bias you of today. That bias is, and here's a little bit of economese, you neglect the opportunity cost of time. Okay, let's unpack what that means. What that means is, so I ran a pretty large survey asking people why they quit their jobs in the last several years. Guess what reason number one is? My boss no longer appreciates me. Makes sense. Reason number two, I did not receive the promotion or the pay raise that I thought I deserved. Makes sense. Reason number three, I got cross with some coworkers. It's no longer fun at work. Makes sense. You can go all the way down to the top 10, and it will all be about something bad that happened in the workplace. That's why I think we make a mistake. You should be just as likely to move if your opportunity set gets better. Have my opportunities suddenly gotten better? We don't think that way because we don't recognize opportunity cost of time. When I'm in this job, when I was a chief economist at Lyft, I was foregoing the opportunity to be the chief economist at Walmart. I left Lyft not because Lyft is cruddy or because something bad happened. I love Lyft. I left Lyft because my opportunity set got better. And I don't think of that as disloyal. I did my job when I was getting paid at Lyft, and my opportunity set expanded enormously. So it pulled me. We're not pulled enough. We only think about our current situation, and we don't start to look until things get cruddy. And it's because we neglect our opportunity cost of time. I talk all about that, and in fact, as was mentioned in the intro, I lead off talking about my golf dream and talking about Vince Lombardi and how my parents wouldn't appreciate that I quit. Okay? Now you can say, well, this guy's just using examples. We also have science on this too. So Steve Levitt and I ran a pretty big experiment where we had people flip a coin around something they were mulling over. They were like, because what happens is you mull over something for like 6 months, and then it's grueling, and you're like, I don't know if I should. So we got 1,000 people like that, and we had them flip a coin. If they flipped heads, they had to quit. Relationship, apartment, job, move cities. If they flipped tails, they had to stick with the status quo. And then we tracked those people for months and months and months. Guess what happens? The people who quit and moved were much, much happier than the people who stuck with the status quo. So now I have science behind what I'm saying. I'd love to see the science behind the inspirational quotes and posters that we all put in our bedrooms. I want to see their science. I have my science, and I talk about the science in the book. Okay? It's hard for me to stand up here and say we don't quit enough, but that's what the science tells me. Okay? Last chapter is about culture. 2-minute culture chapter. Hope I'm not putting you all to sleep, but as you can see, I'm a little bit passionate about this stuff. Culture's hard. I've been working on the gender pay gap for 25 years, trying to figure out why some people in labor markets are paid more than others. And there are a lot of reasons. It's like an onion. You peel it back and you find another reason. But you can narrow it down to a few. And let me talk about those few things. Now, what am I talking about here? Men earn about 20% more than women in the labor market. That's what I'm talking about here. Part of it's human capital differences. So they just have different majors or different levels of education. Part of it's occupation as well. But when you control for all of those, you still have about a 10% difference. So now you have an identical job, and women are earning about 10% less than men. That's what my research in this area has looked at for the last 25 years, using field experiments. Let me tell you about one field experiment. We were set to hire about 1,000 people. So we put out ads. The idea was, let's put out 2 different ads. One ad, typical ad, and it said, wages are negotiable. The other ad was identical to that one, but it took out that sentence. Okay. What do you think happened? In the first one, women negotiated like mad, and they ended up being better negotiators than men. They earned more. In the second one, women hardly negotiated at all. They never stepped up because it was uncertain. It was an ambiguous environment, and they were not sure what they should do, so they took the safe route and didn't negotiate. But the group that negotiated the most in that cell was underqualified men. They were the hardest negotiators. Now, you might ask, well, this is kind of interesting. Okay, this has been replicated, so this is now, you'll read about it in the book. You can say, why does that happen? So some years ago, we decided to take a look at some societies that are in many ways very different from ours. One group we flew to was in Tanzania called the Maasai tribe. Anybody here familiar with the Maasai tribe? Raise your hand. Okay, a few people, good. This is a brutal society for women. I was with the red robe tribe. There were black robed and red robed. You go into that village and you talk to a man and you say, hey, what's your wealth? Or, what's your story? He'll say, I have 20 head of cattle, 3 sheep, 4 donkey, and 7 wives. And then he'll say, I'm thinking about buying another wife, but the price right now is 9 head of cattle, so it's a little bit too expensive. I'm not going to buy another wife just yet. Women are treated like property. The only right those women have is in their hut, 15 minutes a day, their husband has to come and have tea with them. And that's it. We tried to do experiments. They weren't even allowed to hold pencils. That's a patriarchal society. Go as far to the other side as we can. There are no matriarchal societies that I know, but there are some matrilineal societies. In fact, 4 of them that I found. Where I went was Shillong, India, to the Khasi tribe. Anyone ever heard of the Khasis? Raise your hand. Okay, good. You're going to love this story then. So we fly into Shillong, and we get in a taxi, and we take the taxi out to the village. And we keep seeing the same billboard over and over again. So I say to the taxi cab driver, what does that billboard say? His name was Manat. And Manat said, it's those men again. They're arguing for equal rights. They're never going to get it. They were arguing for equal inheritance rights because all of the inheritance runs through the youngest female in the Khasi society. So we went and knocked on the door and we talked to men. The men are sitting around thinking, I'm tired of being a breeding bull and a babysitter. That's what men will tell you there. But they open the door, they take you back to the woman of the house. She decides what's planted that harvest, what goes to market, she takes it to market, she makes the decisions. Now, we went to these communities not so I could tell you this story, but so we could do experiments in them. We wanted to see, how did they negotiate? How do they do things? How is it different than what we do? Well, the punchline is, with the Khasis, their women act like our men, and their men act like our women in these experiments. So the ones who shy away from negotiation are the men. The ones who are aggressive and get more are the women. That's how important socialization is. I can still remember when I was a kid in Sun Prairie. If I was feeling ill and I wasn't performing in gym class, what would my gym teacher yell at me? Hey, List, stop playing like a... And then the girl who was dominant, she'd be a tomboy. Oh, you're a tomboy. From the very beginning, in modern societies, we are taught how we should behave. Slowly, we're breaking those down. Slowly, right? Too slowly, I would say. But nevertheless, that's what this last chapter talks about, building your culture. And I call it building your kabuchu. I didn't even tell you the real story in the chapters about some Brazilian fishing villages that are just enormously successful in building cultures. So I compare that with Uber. Some of you probably heard what happened at Uber. The culture imploded, and Travis ended up getting fired. Okay? So I'm going to stop there and say thanks so much for your attention, and I'll take any questions that you have. Oh, sure, absolutely.
And then we go back there because the other campuses might have questions.
Sounds good. Now, this is good. I like this version. And I'm not a paid spokesperson either. I promise you, I'm not, but I'm paid in smiles. Yeah, so about it, I'm glad to talk about what I've talked about or anything else you have in mind. Yes, go ahead.
Well, John, first, thanks for being here. That was awesome.
Thank you.
My question is back to the preschool you worked with, and you talked about executive functions. You don't think about that when you think about preschool. Can you dive into that a little bit?
Absolutely. I'm glad you asked about that. So, when you think about testing 3, 4, and 5-year-olds, for example, it's like, how do you test these kids? On the cognitive side, this looks like letter recognition, number recognition, etc. There's something called Woodcock-Johnson tests, which are wonderful because they're nationally normed from 2 to 102. So those tests are really out there and well established. Now, the non-cognitive side, or the executive function side, is the wild, wild west, I would say. Okay, so what did we do? We developed some of our own approaches to measure. We took some from psychology. None of them are nationally normed. So we're essentially looking at how much they change over time. We do things like the marshmallow test. And the marshmallow test is an old test from Michelle back in the early 70s that tells a kid, look, here's a marshmallow in front of you. We're going to leave the room, and if we come back and it's still there, we're going to add a marshmallow. And the idea is to look at self-control. And so you can say, well, why are you doing all these tests, like executive function? That's self-control. You have patience. Working with others was very important in our program. Social preferences are very important. And social preferences are about who you share with. So we look at discrimination, whether you share more with a white or black or brown child. And then we measure those traits amongst your parents too. And we find that discrimination is intergenerationally very, very importantly linked, even down to 2 or 3 years old. We have them giving to teddy bears as well, a brown pawed and a white pawed teddy bear as a control. Now, you do all of this because you're trying to find surrogates. So what a surrogate is, of course, if I was just after, let's make kids kindergarten ready, and then that's the only thing, it's not worth doing the research. You want to make them kindergarten ready if that characteristic helps them in life. So the issue, though, is we can't do a program and then sit around for 25 years and get the data. My kids are now sophomores and juniors in high school. So what we do is we try to measure short-run variables like executive function or Woodcock-Johnson or kindergarten readiness or third-grade math scores. And we try to use those as surrogates or predictors of whether they will make it through high school or go to college or drop out or get a good job. So then the idea is when you have new programs, if you move those surrogates, you're in business, because those will later move the good stuff that you really care about, which is changing the life trajectory of this child. So the surrogates now that we find are so far important are both the cog stuff and the executive function skill stuff. In the executive function skill stuff for years, those skills have been neglected. And they're beginning to gain momentum in the academy as very important features, because a lot of times the cog skills depreciate. So a lot of our cog skills they were killing it when they went to kindergarten from our program. By 3rd grade, they're back to control. And that's a lot what happened in Abecedarian and Perry Preschool as well. But the ones that haven't reverted have been the executive function skills that we measured. In fact, we have a paper that was just published last year in the Journal of Political Economy about our 8th graders who took our program versus the control group, and their social preferences still stuck. So their willingness to help others and their ability to put themselves in another person's shoes. It's called theory of mind, which is a very important critical thinking skill. They were still superior versus the control up until 8th grade, and now they're in high school and we're still testing them. So kind of the beauty behind that program was at once we could see if it worked in the short run, and then we can follow the kids. And the thing I didn't talk about were the parent academies in our program. We had some kids who we never taught directly, but we taught their parents. And we incentivized them by putting money in a college tuition fund. So when their child would go to college, they could draw down that fund. The idea there was to set up the incentive to keep parents investing in child. And they have been. So far, so good. Hopefully that answers your question. Great, you liked it. Are you a Badger fan? Little bit. Big basketball win, huh? Yeah, big basketball win. I still think we're undervalued when you look at the betting markets. We're like 50 to 1 to win the national championship, which is kind of crazy, right? Probably have the best player in the country, a bunch of great other players, and then we're still 50 to 1. Yeah, exactly. 100%. Are there any other questions? Any other thoughts, comments, concerns? Yes, go ahead.
Some things that really are not scalable, I think of in politics, that you have two sides that do not hit splash, no matter what you do, you can't seem to affect one side.
Yeah.
We have barriers we cannot really affect.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So I think, I mean, I'm also a believer of what Winston Churchill said. Democracy has all of its warts, but it's the best thing we have. But I do think that the politics of COVID really cost us a lot as a society. And it's, I blame both sides. I don't just blame one person or one side. Because when you think about vaccinations that have truly scaled, one example I commonly think about is the polio vaccination. So that's actually a great story. Jonas Salk has an idea, and he does what most good scientists do. He tests it on his kids first. And then he makes sure it's not a false positive by testing it on other kids. And then he makes sure that, you know, what's the slice of the pie? It works for every kid. So far, so good with COVID. But now comes the time where they depart. We were super smart with the polio vaccinations in tying it to our healthcare system. Because we all have children. If we have children, we know what happens. Baby comes out, everyone congratulates you, they whisk the baby off and do tests. And they give some shots. You come back in 6 months, you get more vaccinations. Come back in 12 months, more, 18 months more. It's not an extra cost for you to get a vaccination for your child. They naturally get it in the progression of making sure your child's okay. And everyone believes it's good for them. They haven't had people argue on both sides. Getting it in people's arms, I'm not here to tell you whether you should or shouldn't, it's your own decision. But if you're after herd immunity, it's really hard to do the way we did it. Because a lot of people are like, I'm not in. And then the other part are like, maybe I'm in, but it's kind of hard because I have to make a special trip, et cetera, et cetera. And then we tend not to do stuff we have to do a little bit of extra for. That's why the default works so well. You're going to read about the default bias in the book. The best way to get people to donate their organs is when they go and get their license, have the box already checked that I'm an organ donor and make them move it to I'm not an organ donor. Then 90% of people will be organ donors. But if you put the check in the other box, 90% of people will not be organ donors. The default matters a lot. And here the default, in Salk's case, the default is great because the default is we want to do well by our kids. So we bring them in. And it also has a nice tendency that once you get it, you're good forever with the polio vaccination. That's a little bit different for us as well, as you know. But in general, yeah, there's no doubt our political system is flawed. I lived it for basically 2 years. But I still think it's the best political system we can have that I know of. There's a political scientist in the room. Maybe he'll disagree with me, but okay. Thanks for your question, though. Yes, go ahead.
You were talking about quitting too soon and so forth. How does that relate? It seems like that's a contrary idea to the idea of grit.
Yeah.
How would you compare and contrast?
Absolutely. That's a great question. Angela is one of my best friends. Angela Duckworth. You can look in the back of the book. The very first quote, I think, is from Angela. Look on the back cover. I think that's a quote from Angela. Angela wrote a book called Grit. Is that what you're referring to as grit, or maybe just a general concept of grit? I like grit, and I think people should have grit. Grit is a very important executive function skill. But misplaced grit is misguided grit and wasted time. If you're digging down a dry well and you refuse to take the data and the signs that there is no gold or oil or whatever in this well, and you say, I have grit. Misplaced grit is misguided, and even Angela will say, John's exactly right. So I believe in grit, but not misguided grit. Absolutely, and that's what I talk about in the chapters. How do you know when to quit? To me, it's about opportunities in the opportunity set. So I wouldn't have quit golf. If I was good at nothing else, and golf was my comparative advantage, I would have stuck with it. If I don't have another hole to dig into, I'm going to keep digging down this one. So it's all about opportunity set and having grit in the right opportunities. So I don't quit if I don't have a better thing to go to. I'd still be at Lyft if I didn't have Walmart to go to. I'd still be at the University of Central Florida. I love the University of Central Florida. That's where I started my career. I would still be there if I didn't have a better opportunity at the University of Arizona. So to me, quitting it's a hard thing to answer. How do you know when to quit? Well, I'm giving you my answer. Look at your opportunity set, periodically look it over, and make sure you have a great thing to go to, a great well to dig down, a great mine to mine diamonds. And you go to it then. But you don't leave before that. You have grit in what you're doing. Does that make sense? And that's what the chapter calls comparative advantage in the book. That's what economists call comparative advantage. I've worked with a lot of super successful people, and they tend to have 4 traits. One is they're monomaniacal. Like, talk to Travis Kalanick. You would say, Travis, what are you up to? My wife and I are trying to change the face of transportation. Well, tell me about your wife. My wife's name is Uber. That's what Travis would say. He was 24/7 trying to change travel for individuals who want to go from A to B. The second is people do what they're good at. That's what I'm talking about here. We tend not to do things that we're good at. We do things that people tell us we should do. And when you do things you're good at, you end up doing things that you love. And then fourth, they use science. A good leader is willing to say, look, I just missed that one. I was just reading Ken Griffin this morning talking about cryptocurrency. And Ken was always negative about crypto, saying it's a farce, this and that. He was doing an interview this morning where he said, I got that one wrong. The data are now coming in and I'm updating. That's a good sign of a leader, someone who's confident in themselves. Okay, so those are some thoughts on just, like President Bush was like this, Colin Powell. I mean, look, the 3 smartest people I met in the White House, Colin Powell, Condi Rice, and Hillary Clinton, they were all like this too. The uber successful people have those 4 traits, is what I've learned. Go ahead. Yes.
So I think that none of us can really look at the news right now and not see what's going on with Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah.
Yes. However, I found it incredibly fascinating that it's become more of an economic war.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to give your, like, really honestly, just open-ended, see what your thoughts are. But I was thinking, we're looking at, your 5 ingredients, or it needs scalability.
Yeah.
And that's not really what's happening right now. It seems like the
No, absolutely.
countries.
Yes.
And so I just, your thoughts on, like, war isn't, it needs scalability.
Yeah.
It's happening. What is Putin missed out of your 5 ingredients, do you think, to really?
Well, he has what he needs, right? It's a nuclear weapon, that scales. Right, I mean, so war does scale if you have the right technology. But I want to come back to your first point about economics. Because I'm not an expert in this. I mean, I'm a history minor from UW Stevens Point, so I've taken some history classes. Roger Knowlton was one of my favorite professors. Here is a history professor. I think every war is about economics. Like when you say, well, this has become an economic war, I know that right away people said, well, it's about NATO and et cetera, but that ultimately leads to economics. Like I always say, economics is life and life is economics. And I think every war, when you look back, has an element of economics to it. Now, I think Putin made the exact same mistake that we made when I was working back in the White House. Because I can still remember that February, we were delivering the economic report to the president. It's February 2003. And the president had us all in the Oval Office, and he was talking about war and Iraq. Remember, this was this February of a year and a half after 9/11. So we were still chasing the bad guys, and we were getting back intelligence that was telling us if we roll the tanks in, everyone's going to come on our side and support us, and everyone wants us in there. So guess what? We rolled it in, and it wasn't that easy. At the end of my time at the White House, I was this close to flying over and lying in one of his palaces in Baghdad to try to get the economy back up started. There were 7 currencies being used. Nobody had jobs. It was just a total mess. We hadn't planned for the difficulty and what would happen to the economy after when we invaded Baghdad. And I think Putin was met with the exact same realization. I think his intelligence was coming back saying, there's a lot of bad stuff happening there. Everyone hates Zelensky. They might have guns, but they're gonna run to our side as soon as we roll in. That's what we thought too. Didn't happen. And I think, I mean, the Ukrainians, I have a good friend who actually is a professor. His name's Roman Sheremetyev. He just moved over there. He was a professor at Case Western. And in December, he moved over there to Kiev, and he knew what was coming. We all knew that this was coming. And he goes, I just want to be back in the Ukraine. And when I heard him say that, there was a sense of pride that I had the sense that if Putin does invade, it's going to be a little bit like what happened to us in Baghdad, and that's exactly what's happened. Now, ultimately, look, he has 40 miles of armored vehicles lined up. It's going to, in the end, he's going to occupy every city. But I'm not sure where it goes from there. For what gain? He can put in a puppet government, but then it's probably going to fail. There are going to keep being terrorist attacks and fights. So I'm not sure what the end game is, unless he wanted to use that as a vehicle to go all around and get the old USSR back. But that's pretty hard now that NATO's lining up troops at it's taken them too long. So, but I've skirted your question a bit, but I've done the best I can. Okay, thanks for your question. Any other thoughts? Yeah, go ahead.
Back to the Chicago Heights experiment.
Sure.
After thinking about all issues, how would you change if you really wanted to scale that up?
Yeah. No, that's great. Great question. On the teacher side, I would have done nearly everything the same, but I would have oversampled marginal teachers. So I didn't do the really bad thing like most academics do, which is just hire 20 teachers and put them under the University of Chicago, and you're going to get these brilliant teachers coming in. That's how we do business most of the time. And my fellow academicians aren't happy that I've called this out in the book, to be fair. I did a little bit better than that, but I didn't do good enough in terms of even the teachers that I hired, the 30 teachers, are not representative if I truly want to scale that thing. And it turns out that teachers are a non-negotiable. So when I talked about, is it the chef or is it the ingredients? An important element of that chapter is figure out what are your non-negotiables, and then make sure that when you can scale them, those non-negotiables are available at a price that you can pay. So in this particular case, if I would have done that from the beginning, and I didn't know about this, I didn't think about it. That's why I wrote the book in part. I didn't think about this. But when you're drawing from the same input market, and it's a human that is kind of unique, you kind of have to be good to be a teacher, there's going to be an upward sloping labor supply curve, which means if I want to expand, I need to go up that labor supply curve and pay higher and higher wages. That's called diseconomies of scale in economies. So what I would have done is I would have tested more there and say, does my curriculum work with the kinds of teachers that I'll be able to hire at scale? I would have found no. And then I would have said, I need to change my curriculum in the Petri dish. And let's now go back to the lab and change it and come up with something that can work with the humans who I can hire. So let me be clear. When I say unique humans don't scale, I mean it. That doesn't mean ideas that include humans don't scale. What I'm saying is know the kinds of humans you can hire at scale and make sure your idea works with them in the very first stage. We don't do that because we tend to give our ideas the best shot. What I'm saying is just give them a normal shot. Give people the truth. Policy-based evidence. Did that answer your question? Very good. Yes, go ahead.
Do you think the long-term lifetime gain of these kids that were helped, is that worth the cost of those better teachers?
No, 100%. I think you should always ask yourself, what's your ROI? Because the government is a huge spending body. And I'm with you. I'm for small government. In the case of early childhood, I can say that there is enough evidence that tells you, for example, skills beget skills. I want you to think about investing in young children as a fund that will continue to yield dividends over time. So do I think the data support hiring a little better teachers and having universal pre-K for all? Yes, for sure. And that ROI is not even close to being as low as other things. But I think it's a very, very good investment that we can make as a society. Now, it's for two reasons. One, because every kid needs early training, 3, 4, and 5. And two, for equity. The fact is, the opportunity gap in America, you don't even realize it unless you visit and work in places like Chicago Heights. You don't realize the opportunity differences in the gaps. So if you don't care about equity, that's fine. That's your prerogative. You don't like broccoli? Fine. I'm an economist who says, just tell me your preferences. But if you care about efficiency and you care about a modern economy that will have a lot of economic growth, you would still do this. You don't even need the equity argument. It's the best investment that I see public dollars can make right now. And a lot of it's because skills beget skills. If you have skills early on, you're more able to get skills later in first grade and second grade and third grade. And if you don't, you're like my 15 and 16-year-olds who are reading at a second grade level. And I would also put with that a parent academy, because many parents don't know how to raise their child on the academic side. Many parents have not gone through high school themselves. They love their child, they want to invest, they're working 3 jobs, they're not sure what to do. In fact, we have a recent paper in Nature that shows that low SES families, their parents don't think the brain is mutable. They don't think their investments even matter, so they don't invest. At an early age, 0 to 3, I do a little bit of neuroscience as well. It's amazing, the neurons in the development in the brain at a very early age. And there are critical periods in there, there are critical windows that if you don't get the good stuff during those windows, you can't make up for it. That's why the ROI is so high. Does that answer your question? Yes, go ahead.
Back to the beginning, how did Pete Casson incentivize you?
I love that. Pete Casson. Wow, one of my favorites. So that's great. I love that question. Pete is just a wonderful, wonderful man. Partial academic / golf scholarship. He had me at hello. Pete did, really. And Pete's gruff. I don't know if any of you know Pete, but Pete is a gruff guy, but fatherly. And he was the only person who recruited me. The only person who recruited me. There was another place that recruited me. It was MATC. His name was Jack Brennigan. So Jack Brennigan was the AD and the basketball coach back then, and he recruited me to play basketball. So I was actually all Big 8 in basketball and golf at Sun Prairie, but everyone told me I was too small to play basketball at 5'10". So they said, you're not going to make it in that. And then I actually like golf a little bit more anyway. And it was Lisa Anderson, who was a family friend of mine. She was a junior here on campus, and she worked for Pete, and she told Pete about me. And when I got that email from Pete, I knew I could go to college. I had not been thinking about going to college before that, really. And he opened that door. And yeah, a little bit of money, called it academic / golf, and away you go, $400 or $500 a year. Because I did reasonably well on the ACT. I took it after a pretty hard night of partying, but I still did okay. We had just beaten Beloit Memorial the night before, and they were ranked number 5 in the state. And yeah, I scored 34 points, so I was ready for the party that night. No drugs, but maybe a little bit of the stuff, right? But thanks for your question, Pete. I'm so glad you brought that up. Pete's just wonderful. Yes, go ahead. Yeah, that's a great question. No, a great question. So in the spillovers chapter, I talk a lot about social media, and I introduce network externalities. So this is chapter 4. So what network externalities are is think about Facebook. If only you and 3 other people, and none of your other friends or family have Facebook, it's not really that valuable. But as it grows and more people use Facebook, the service itself, the platform itself, becomes more valuable to you. That's called a network externality, and a lot of social media has that. So the good stuff there is, in the small, it doesn't look so great. But in the large, it's going to have high voltage. So any good that has a network externality has that. The bad stuff of Facebook is the lies and the misinformation campaigns. So on that dimension, it's difficult. So I have a student this year on the job market who's working on curbing misinformation on Twitter and what these different rules and such due to the amount of misinformation that you see. So that's a bad part of that good, is the misinformation campaigns and what happens there. But the idea itself about when it scales, does it get bigger and better, that has great properties, social media. Now, it's not true of all technology. So something I talk about in the book are these smart thermostats. Do you know what a smart thermostat is? People are nodding their heads, so some people do. I have one in my house. Smart thermostat's interesting because when it first was introduced, the engineers gave wildly optimistic estimates about it would save the world from climate change. These smart thermostats, you put it in your house and it moderates the temperature. When you're gone, it uses less energy. When you're sleeping, it uses less, etc. The original engineering estimates turned out to be entirely wrong. We have this experiment whereby we sent like 200,000 of these to households and then compared it to households who didn't have it, and you save zero from it. And the reason why is because humans go into the technology and they undo the defaults or the presets. And they undo it exactly enough to undo all the good stuff that the engineers thought was going to happen. So mentally, you should think about Commander Spock is what the engineers thought was going to happen, but it was advanced into a market with Homer Simpsons. So guys who have these behavioral biases, like me, I have one of these and I've undone, I'm too dumb to read the 28 pages that tell you, and then I go and undo the presets. I was exactly like the 200,000 households in California. So technology is interesting that way. Now, I've been working a lot in AI. And AI is interesting because AI gives a lot of old ideas that have been shuttered as not scalable. I think technology, for all the bad stuff, and I understand the complaints about technology, I totally get it, but technology might bring forward ideas that were scrapped before that are now scalable. And I think that's sort of a unique way to think about the problem is, we have a guy from Create, so I hope you're thinking about this. Like what ideas that we've scrapped and thought are not scalable now might have a shot because of the technological changes, whether it's social media, a different way to get to a group of people through advertising, or whether it's the AI I'm talking about is the machine is as good of a programmer in R or SQL or Python as humans now, which is amazing. I should tell my son not to get a computer science degree anymore because the humans are gonna be displaced. But hope that answers your question. So I have some thoughts on that.
I think we're out of time.
Okay. Oh yeah, very good. Thanks everyone. Thank you.